Good to have each of you here this evening. As is our normal routine of things, on the second Sunday night of each month, we talk about a lesson from our theme, which is building up and strengthening one another or encouraging one another. And so tonight we're going to be talking about some warning signs for spiritual apathy. You know, it's not enough to just fit Jesus into your life somewhere. Jesus is to be our life. He's to be the focus that we have. It's so easy to go through the motions of things in this world and do just what the world believes makes one a good Christian, what the world perceives one of those looks like. But it's another thing completely to pick up our cross and daily follow Jesus, despite the current flowing in the opposite direction. So tonight I want to talk about some of these things and consider, is spiritual apathy creeping into our life? You know, what are some warning signs of that? And maybe we need to kind of shake our soul up a little bit to see things as they are and work on some of that. So hopefully it'll be a good study for us tonight as we look at some of these things. Familiarity is the first one. There is a term in the film industry called visual lethargy. Lethargy, I think that's right. That describes the process of becoming desensitized to the same sight over and over again. It's something that we've probably all experienced in one way or another. Ken, you're going to think I stole this illustration from you, but I promise you I didn't. You've been on vacation before, and you go to your cabin, and you look out and you look at the ocean. You look at the sand, and you're thinking, wow, that's beautiful. That is gorgeous. Those waves coming in, the sunset or the sunrise, depending on what coast you're on. And it's just so pretty. You can just sit there and think about that and be filled with awe and gratitude for that opportunity. Or you're up in the mountains, you got your cabin in the mountains, you're looking, wow, this is tremendous, this view. And you're just stunned by all of that. Fast forward about 5 days, you walk by and you're like, oh, that's pretty. You know, that looks pretty nice. Kids, be quiet. You know, you kind of get desensitized to that view that's around you. And as you know, if you were to buy that precious vacation cabin, the view would become commonplace, just like anything else. And so think about that, and you know those things to be accurate, I'm going to guess. And such is the case, or can be the case, with the things of God. The grace of God that left us so breathless at one point can feel routine over time. Scripture that really had an impact on your life, brought you to your knees, made you emotional. Read that before. Sure, I can do all things through Christ. Is there anything else? Really? I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, all things through Jesus Christ, and we're going to take that as commonplace. When that happens, when the sacred becomes something common, you know, we're becoming in danger of wearying God based upon that kind of attitude. Familiarity is a powerful force because it can drive us to two extremes. It can drive us to intimacy. It can drive us to apathy. And just as in a marriage, you have to strive to rekindle that affection. We're talking about that on Wednesday nights. You have to rekindle. You have to strive to improve in those things and not let something become just familiar. So it is with our belief in God. So it is for our recapturing the awe that is God. To be before Him and to recognize who He really is, to worship Him without an agenda, without thinking about other things, thinking about the goodness that is Him and being in His presence. That should never be a familiar thing in the sense of it just being commonplace. You know, it was more difficult in Jesus's day for the people of Nazareth to believe that He was the Son of God. More difficult for them than it was in any other city. And that's interesting to think about. Why? Familiarity. That's what they were familiar with. Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he goes on to read from Isaiah chapter 61. We're not going to read that, as that's not really the point of this. But at the end of that reading, he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed upon him. And he began to say to them, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And all were speaking well of him and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. And they were saying, "Is this not Joseph's son?" And he said to them, "No doubt you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we heard was done at Capernaum, do here at your hometown as well." And he said, "Truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown." Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad, thinking about Jesus, the Son of God, all that he is, and they have that kind of reaction? Because the fact is, they think they know all there is about Jesus. They think they've got him figured out. You know, this is the guy that he delivered the furniture to me when his dad made it. You know, this is the guy that his parents thought he was in the caravan and he wasn't, you know. This is the little kid that was over here and did one thing or another. That's what they remembered about Jesus. Mark's account goes so far as to say in chapter 6 and verse 6 that he was amazed at their unbelief. And so think about Jesus, the Son of God. Think about him in Nazareth, and think about what a shame that really is, that they have that kind of reaction. But when things become too familiar, we can suck the spiritual power right out of it. We can take what's good about something and just wipe it out if we're not careful. How many times have you read that passage in Luke chapter 4 that we just were talking about? 10 times? 100 times? 1,000 times? And yet, whenever we read a story like that, whenever we talk about a story like that, do we ever think in our minds at least, "Oh yeah, I know that one. I know that story. I remember that one." If that's our attitude of, "I already know it," then we're in trouble, aren't we? How will we ever gain in our study of the Bible with that attitude? How will we ever grow to know things better if it's just, "I already know it. I've already got it"? How will we ever want to know more if it's just familiar and we're content with that? I don't want steak. I've had steak 1,000 times. That's crazy talk, right? That's ridiculous. No, I want one more. No, just because something is familiar doesn't mean you shouldn't want that. And maybe we could relate to that somewhat. But familiarity can have the opposite effect on us, because it falsely makes us think, well, we're experts, right? I mean, we know that. That's a familiar story. We understand that. We know it. It makes us think that we're experts in religion. But I would say we're disciples, right? We're learners. We're not experts. We're trying to be more experts, but we are disciples. We're learners. And that's really what the people of Nazareth thought. "Oh, Jesus, we know him. In fact, we know all about him. There's nothing new here." Familiarity can blind us with pride if we're not careful. Certainly a warning sign for spiritual apathy. If it's just old hat, just the old usual, and we already know that, that's not going to help us a whole lot. Number 2, boredom. Remember when we first began to believe the gospel? Can you remember the sense of relief you had, the joy you had, the overwhelming love that you were thinking about with what Jesus had really done for you, the beauty of Jesus' sacrifice and what that really means? That's not something you can get bored with, is it? If we're not careful, huh? Think about what the Israelites felt when they were delivered from slavery, when that's all they knew. God came, with Moses, reached down and made a way for them to get out of that. Not only that, made it possible for them to get across the Red Sea. Miraculous things, impressive things. Surely that would be enough, right? There was no denying that. They didn't do that themselves. It was God. But you know what? The wilderness awaited them. That journey from Egypt to the land of Canaan went from being a year trip to being a 40-year pilgrimage because of Israel's disobedience. Think about that transition of things. Moses going up in the mountain. Moses, why are you taking so long? This is ridiculous. Aaron, make us a god. We're tired of waiting. We're tired of having to wait for Moses to come down. Who knows if he's even going to make it? We're tired of this manna. The wilderness of spiritual boredom is pretty dangerous as well, full of temptations to go back to the old ways of things, to go back to the familiar. Remember how good those old slave masters were. It's hard to think you would even think of that kind of phrase. Numbers chapter 11 and verse 5, we remember the fish we used to eat freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, garlic. You were slaves. You're going to talk about it in terms of remembering that fondly? You were slaves. Have you forgot everything that happened between then and now? We used to eat fish freely. Wow. But it really does take a new kind of strength and growth to come by waiting and doing those things that are right and pleasing to God, even amongst those things that are familiar, those things that have grown to be more common in our thinking. The answer for Israel was not to complain and to be bored and to be unimpressed. That certainly wasn't the answer. The wilderness of our spiritual life is where we gain maturity. It's where we grow, where maturity is going to take root in the time that passes by, in our diligence in going through the things that are everyday things. In Psalm chapter 92, verses 12 through 14, the psalmist says, "The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing." That's kind of what mature Christians are like, isn't it? They're planted, they flourish, they grow, they bear fruit even in old age. And the remarkable thing about that analogy of a tree growing and flourishing and bearing fruit is there's a lot of time that passes by. A lot of time that's settled and still and quiet. A lot of days and years that goes by to bring about that maturity and to bring about that fruitfulness. Otherwise, the tree wouldn't be stable. It would be uprooted. It would be weak. It would be unfruitful. Waiting is sometimes boring, but it's what brings out the depth of the roots. Remember in Malachi chapter 1, when the people are offering the lame and the sick and the blemished to God. And he makes a point there in verse 13 of Malachi 1 that they were saying, "My, how tiresome it is." And God essentially is telling them, just shut the gates. Just don't even kindle the fire on the altar. There's no use. There's no reason for that. They were bored to death with offering sacrifices to God. They were going through the motions, but they weren't putting in what they needed to. And that's a pretty serious thing to think about, and certainly one that we can all learn from. But if it's boredom, if we're bored, then that's surely a sign of spiritual apathy. We need to take heart to what got us here in the first place and think about the reaction we really should have with the gospel, how it's not really so common, not really so ordinary like that, it is an amazing thing, and one that should never cause us boredom. Mediocrity is the next one. So-so, just okay, fair, not great. Certainly the acceptance of mediocrity in our life is not really going to help us be what we need to be, right? Ordinary and mediocre, that's the word, are not really the same thing, because there's nothing wrong with living an ordinary life with extraordinary faithfulness to God. I mean, we see that all the time in the scriptures, right? Just regular, ordinary people with extraordinary faith are called for the service of God. God hasn't called us for sensationalism. He's called us to excellence, to be the best that we can be in our Christianity. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men. Spiritual mediocrity is going to result when we just kind of adopt sin and learn to live a life that's tolerant to that, to learn to live a life with a lack of faith, thinking it's not really going to be any better. I'm just going to be happy with the little faith that I have. I'm not really going to conform my life anymore. I'm just going to be content where I'm at, and I'll just choose to be satisfied in that kind of condition. If we're content with compromise in our lives, as long as we can convince ourselves that we're not going to go to hell because of it, then it's okay. It's okay then. The lukewarm can have it boiled down to, if it's I'm not going to go to hell sort of situation, then it's all right. And that's really a paralyzing deception that keeps us comfortable in that mediocrity and doesn't really inspire us to do anything better, to do any good things and great things, and to better ourselves in our service to God. The nation of Israel, again, sinned again and again, got out of it, went back in it, got out of it, went back in it. They continued in those things, never really coming out of their idolatry, it doesn't seem like, but always ready to go back. We studied about Gideon here recently. Gideon was a part of a nation that was constantly falling back into their sinful patterns. They didn't dare fight the Midianites. Midianites were powerful. They didn't think they could ever win that battle, so they adapted. They adapted in that situation. I'm not going to be able to beat them. I'm not going to get any better. So I'm just going to be happy to be alive and be doing what I can do, be content and satisfied with my failure that I would be involved with in that situation. And yet that was kind of the extent of it, of being in that bad situation. God saw things, of course, very differently. He sees us very differently as he looks at us through his power, through his ability, through the salvation that he offers. And for whatever reason, he sees something in us that he desires us to be a part of. And that's pretty exciting, really, to think about. He sees that we can do something. We can be a part of something. He wants us to be successful with that. He wants us to believe it when he says, I'll be with you. And he wants us to take that to heart. God was able to get Gideon out of his situation, and he could certainly help you and I as well. Judges 6 and verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the land of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? Now, we know there's a little more hesitation in it than all that. Gideon wasn't ready to say, okay, that's great. There was a lot of questions that he had. But think about that. God understood that Gideon could do this, and ultimately Gideon did that. And he wasn't going to use that as an excuse for him not to do anything. And so when we think about our own lives, has mediocrity crept into that? Are we satisfied with the time that we put in for Bible study, the time we set aside for reading? Are we mediocre in those things? Do we pursue purity in our life with mediocrity or conviction? When it comes to serving, When it comes to loving, the way that we live, when it comes to leading, are we the person who is about the bare minimums, or are we about doing more than that? One writer that I read said, mediocrity is the sum of all the times we choose to take the easy path with our faith. And so it is interesting to think about all of that in relation to ourselves, in relation to what we see in the scriptures and what people really could do and accomplish with God. Finally tonight, disconnection is the last one. We are so connected, right? With the digital age that we live in, disconnection seems like it really shouldn't be a problem, but it really is. We live in a world where you can have 500 friends and still feel isolated and abandoned, right? Doesn't really mean a whole lot, does it? If it's just friends on Facebook. Solitude is a gift from God, but isolation is not. It's a tool that can work against us for sure. As a culture, we are more connected maybe than ever before, but maybe more isolated than ever before. And that's kind of a strange 21st century paradox of sorts. We're connected to more people than ever before, and yet feel alone sometimes more than ever before. The trouble with disconnection isn't just physical or emotional, but it can be spiritual as well. Because we were designed by God to live and thrive in Him, to be a part of Him, to have an accountability, to have an encouragement, to have genuine relationships. Hebrews 10, verses 24 and 25, where the writer says, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Connecting with others, connecting with God, being a part of all of that, how can we encourage and stir up one another to love and good works? How can we be together that's going to help us in our daily walk? It's not just about forsaking the assembly and not being in services. It's about so much more, stirring up one another to love and good works, being a part of one another's life. The very fact that the world's creation and our own shows us that God wants that relationship to flourish. In fact, Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, Paul said, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Think about creation. It's an amazing thing to think about, but it certainly shows us some things about God, about his qualities, about what he has to offer. We are built to connect with God. And everything else you may try to have a closest to like that is not going to work. It's not going to satisfy. When you read the Psalms, isn't it impressive how God is talked about over and over? God, you alone, you're the only one that truly satisfies the heart. You are the one that calms our fears. Your word is more precious than silver. You're a rock. You're a shelter. You're a fortress. All of those things talk about God, and of course so many more, about who God is and how he desires that kind of relationship with us. He wants us to be connected with him. It's frustrating for us when the Wi-Fi goes out or the camera doesn't connect up with the computer. Sometimes you gotta reconnect it, you gotta restart it, you gotta get it going again. But our relationship with God, we need to be connected with him. We don't need to let that go. We don't need to be disconnected from him. Reconnect with God. Take that seriously as to that relationship. After the 3,000 were converted in Acts chapter 2, it says they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayers. In verses 46 and 47, they continued daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. Think about that kind of being together, that connectivity, the relationship that they had, the growth that was taking place there. It's pretty powerful just being a spiritual person, that's not really enough. It's not about just trying to do that on our own. It doesn't really work. And so we have to consciously make that effort that we're gonna be connected back to God, that we're gonna be a part of that. We're gonna be a part of his people, and we're gonna take that seriously. You're not studying enough? Start. Put your mind in that. Make a commitment. I'm gonna come to Bible class if you're not already. I'm gonna make that a priority. I'm gonna come to the men's study. I'm gonna come to the ladies' class. I'm going to be at the Thursday night study or the monthly Thursday night study. Make it a priority. Not praying? Well, start. Doesn't mean you have to pray an hour the first time. Just start. Are you discouraged? Spend some time with your brethren. Go to lunch. Go to Los Pinos after Sunday night services. There's always an opportunity and a chance. Ask for help. Ask to study with somebody. There's all kinds of different ways that we can be more involved, be more connected, and be a part of everything as we see them being together in the first century. You know, when the church at Laodicea, when Jesus rebuked them, you know, it wasn't for gross immorality. It wasn't for doctrinal compromise. It was apathy born out of their pride. In Revelation 3, verses 15 through 17, Jesus said, I know your works, that you're neither cold nor hot. I could wish you were cold or hot. So then, because you're lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked? They thought they had it all. They were apathetic. They thought they didn't have a need. They weren't striving to do what the Lord really wanted. They thought they had it all figured out. In closing tonight, you know, let's think about ourselves and be vigilant to make sure that that's not us, and that if it is, we're doing something about it, and that we're going to look out for one another as well as brethren. Make sure we don't fall into the trap of apathy, because that's not going to help us. It's going to hurt us. It's going to hold us back. It's going to hold us down. It's going to discourage us. And it's going to make us be where we're not where we need to be. And so tonight, as you think about these things, think about your relationship with the Lord. Think about the direction that you're going. If your life is not right, you have the opportunity tonight to change that. And we hope that we can help you however we can, if you'll let it be known by coming forward. Together we stand and sing.
When we walk with